My name is John Rentoul. I'm Chief Political Commentator for the Independent on Sunday. The hashtag is Roots of Poverty. So tweet away. This is the third in a series of fringe meetings on this subject at each of the party conferences. So by the end of this one, we will have solved the problem of child poverty in the UK. The government is about to launch a consultation on the definition of child poverty and the child poverty target, which Tony Blair foolishly declared in 1999, I think, to end child poverty by 2020, defined as children living in families, households below 60% of median earnings, as you all know, because you are all obviously experts. The one thing that has been added to the debate, which I thought I would flag up at the start, was the Chancellor's suggestion yesterday, if it was it only yesterday, his suggestion that if you pay too much state benefit to people on the basis of how many children they have, they will have too many children, which I think ought to stir some controversial views. I think there is obviously some truth in that. The question is, how do you balance alleviating child poverty with incentives for people to have children? Let me introduce the first speaker, Claire Perry. She is a banker.
Oh, please. Christ, I worked in financial services 14 years ago. I'm proud of that. I've been sanitised by motherhood. Okay.
And she is now an MP, and she is going to solve child poverty in 8 minutes and leave lots of time for questions.
Thank you. Oh dear, this introduction. It was even worse when it was question time in Stoke-on-Trent, but what can you do with the left? Look, I've spoken at a number of fringe events at this conference, and I confess I was most concerned about this, not because, well, I've been on several panels with Polly, who's formidable, but because we have just talked and talked so much ideological hot air, in my view, about this over the years, and successive governments have talked and talked. And I was reading, the political lines to take provided by my party, and I was reading some of the Labour Party's pronouncements, and it just seems to have almost no resonance with the actual problem to me. And so I thought, rather than trying to do a sort of politically, you'll think of this as politically motivated, I'm a politician, but there was this view that it's an entirely financial definition. Now you all know this better than I, the 60% definition, that we must enshrine a very admirable attempt to reduce child poverty in law. And I watched Poor Kids, as I'm sure many of us have done, and I believe that every family in that heartbreaking documentary had some problem, some fundamental problem. It was a problem of generational worklessness, it was a problem of addiction, it was a problem of family breakdown. And we all talk about that as being very, very important in contributing to the sort of bottom-up causes of child poverty, and yet we seem to spend our lives raging around the definition. I'm a great supporter of Frank Field. He's been campaigning in this area forever. He has come out and said he thinks the 60% definition is actually not helpful. I know it's important internationally, but we've had a recession where the top and median incomes have fallen. So by that definition, we have had a relative reduction in child poverty. Well, that is insanity to me, because clearly we haven't. We are stuck with the same endemic, intractable, often very localised problems we have always had. And we've also, I think, tested to destruction the idea that you can pour money into the system and it will somehow make a real measurable difference in the life chances of poor children. I mean, the last government, for all the right reasons, poured 150 billion into tax credits between 2004 and 2010, and we can argue with the statistics, and there were some improvements, but of course we all then saw that in the last term the actual numbers of children living in this relative defined measure of poverty increased by 200,000. So and I know that's where the debate's going to go today. We're going to be raging about targets and numbers, and isn't it important? I mean, let's just stop, and I think most people in this room would understand that it is normally families who are struggling with other problems other than perhaps relative income that create the long-term persistence problems of child poverty that we seem to be unable to solve. And and I'm sorry I'm at the wrong event for doing this, but one of the things I'm very proud of is I help judge the Centre for Social Justice Awards every year. Sorry, Policy Exchange. But it is an amazing insight into what actually the problems are out there and how there are organisations who do have good models and interesting models, not necessarily scalable, for tackling them. And the approaches, of course, the government's taken around the pupil premium, of which I'm a very keen supporter. I'm also a supporter of the increased pupil premium for military families, because that's important to me. And I know there's some pushback in terms of only 10% of schools have said that this is making too much. The premium's only been up and running for a year. And I, as a governor of 2 comprehensives in my constituency, can already see that the schools feel empowered to say, well, I mean, the classic thing was one of the schools saying, you know, we got money through whatever the scheme was, it was a catch-up reading scheme, but it was so complicated we didn't apply for it. You know, whereas now what we've said is if a child comes to you and they actually are struggling, if they're dropping their head, here's more money, you decide, you're the educators, you decide how to do this. Now arguably that's too late, you know, when a child's actually entering the secondary education system. We all, I think, would agree that the root causes of you know, reduced life chances start much earlier. So the whole discussion around early years care, what do we do with childcare, I've just come out of a very lively childcare debate where everybody said we have very expensive childcare in which we spend £7 billion a year, and we know we're not reaching some of the families who would most like to access it. Again, there's this kind of intractable problem that we sort of forget about. I, of course, am a fan of universal benefits, universal credit, I should say. Not a fan of universal benefits. Particularly, I think it's mad to tax my constituents to pay me child benefit, but that's a different debate. And I had a very telling example of a single mum who lives on a housing estate in Devizes. Devizes, by the way, is my ward with the highest level of poverty, about 20%, which is probably surprisingly high. Most people, I think, would think lovely leafy Wiltshire, you know, but there are pockets of deprivation all over the country that are often completely ignored, I think, in the national statistics. Single mum, little daughter, great, wants to work as a teaching assistant, totally stymied by the current system because there is absolutely no economic incentive for her to work even a few hours a week. And it's madness. To me, the biggest chance of being in poverty as a woman is to be a single mother on benefits, you know, and to just be unable to access the work system and the support that's there. So I'm a huge fan of universal credit, which I think, if implemented properly, will provide a much smoother transition into work and will increase the ability to work and get childcare, which I think is so important. And the final thing is, and I'll stop here because the CSJ work has been very important, the troubled families agenda, I think is, and I'd be interested in the correlation between, I mean, troubled families is a very pejorative term, I find, actually, but I'd be very interested in the child poverty analysis of children living in troubled family structures, of which we think there are, what, 150,000 or so in the country. And so the commitment of 500 million quid to say, again, bottom up, let's work with those families, let's understand what these intergenerational problems are, the problems of addiction, the problems of, you know, low birth weight, all these different things, and let's really try and work on those very individual cases. So I'm not here to defend the government. I am a believer in reducing the deficit. It is not progressive to leave our debts to the next generation, and frankly I'm sick to death of debating statistics about child poverty that actually do so little to help those on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. You raised some very important questions which Neil O'Brien can now answer because he's working on a piece of work for Policy Exchange shortly to be published on redefining child poverty.
Here we are, and I should apologise to anybody who's already heard this speech before because we've done this at all of the policy conferences. I feel like I've been on a road trip with Polly and John. It's week 3, so apologies if you stop me if you think you've heard this one before. So the first thing to say is I do think it was an important thing to set a target to reduce child poverty. I'm not sure I agree with the target that was set, but it's an important ambition. And I should also start by recognising the progress that was made under the last government. They did make progress on a number of fronts, and they didn't just do one thing, they did try to do a mix of employment and also improving people's incomes and other things like that, and education too. So it wasn't all wrong. But now we're in a much more difficult place, and it's interesting that I think a new sort of consensus around child poverty is forming. You listen to the Labour Party, Ed Miliband says that the option of simply increasing tax credits in the way that we did before will not be open to us. And John Denham says we need to shift investment from tax credits to affordable childcare. And the IPPR, a kind of mirror image of Policy Exchange, not that's good obviously, call for a more strategic approach focused on childcare and ensuring that the families who do work are not in poverty. So maybe we are inching towards a consensus where we're going to shift the balance a little bit from giving people more cash to helping them earn their way out of poverty. There is, of course, this big consultation going on the target, and I think there are some problems with the target. There's always perverse things that have already been touched on. You know, you end up saying that poverty now is higher in Britain than it was in the 1970s, when only half of households had central heating and we were a much poorer country. It doesn't really capture, there's something about transience as well. So on the current measure, more than half of households have been in poverty at some point in the last decade, and that feels sort of intuitively wrong. But the central problem with the current target is it really pushes government towards income transfers as a central solution, rather than services or needs. And the problem with that, of course, is that that reduces work incentives as well. There's a straight trade-off between giving people more money and making their work incentives worse. So what do we need to do to improve child poverty? How could we improve on what the last government did? Well, you can see in the way that they spent money that their approach was quite heavily geared towards income transfers. We spent £22 billion a year on child tax credit, which you don't need to be working to claim. We spent another £12 billion on child benefit, and both of those discourage work. And we only spent £8 billion on the working tax credit, which is the reward for people who work hard on lower incomes. We can also see it in the results. So the majority of the people who were lifted out of poverty during the Labour years remained workless. They were workless, they remained workless. And this is the point that Nick Clegg is trying to get at with his point about poverty plus a pound. They have got more money, and it's not just an arbitrary target. A lot of these people who are workless have got more money, and that's good. Having more money when you are really poor is great. But when we said for years we thought we were lifting all these people out of poverty, it seems strange to say that if you're still in, you know, you're still not working, you're still in maybe the same really bad social housing, your kids are maybe still going to the worst school in town. To say that you were lifted out of poverty, I wonder if we're kidding ourselves a little bit. So the current government, like the last government, has a broadly based approach. It's got 15 different child poverty targets in its strategy. How would I improve on that? The first is I would go further in terms of focusing on work as the route out. Because of the rise of part-time employment, female employment, there are a lot more people who are in working poverty now. How can we help them? So I've talked in The Guardian over the weekend about, you know, doing some quite radical things, doing direct government job creation paid for by reducing middle-class welfare. We've got to improve the way job centres work. We've got to maybe move beyond the 90s approach, which said just work first and didn't really look at whether people were just cycling in and out of the benefit system, bumping along the runway, in the memorable phrase of the JRF. So more welfare reform, perhaps asking more of people, having better job centres that are more personalised, but also creating more help, more rewards for those who work hard on low incomes, maybe even just creating jobs in the areas of the country that are in the most trouble. Second thing I would do to add to the government's anti-poverty agenda is to think much more about costs, and particularly housing. So back in the early 60s, housing was accounted for about 10% of people's incomes. It now takes up 20% of people's incomes, and that's been a really important driver of poverty. And you can see the number of people being pushed into poverty on the after housing cost measure has gone up. In fact, the contribution of the housing market is not quite as big as the impact on inequality of the Thatcher years, but actually nearly as big. And it's something that, although a lot of people get very angry about the Thatcher years and the rise in inequality there, we haven't noticed what the housing market's been doing. It's been doing lots of bad things in terms of pushing people into poverty. I think we should think more about deeper poverty. So Claire's already mentioned, you know, problem families, but there's a lot more ways to think about it than that. We could think about the 350,000 children who live with drug-dependent parents. Unfortunately, I only know that there's that many children because of a one-off survey that the DWP did in about 2002. We don't really track a lot of these families. We don't really do enough to manage them. And there's a whole group of different people with different problems that the state has quite a lot of interaction with, but we don't do enough. The state does not do enough to be a kind of good parent to all of these people. For example, the 60,000 children who live in the care system. You know, we could do more to prevent them going into care in the first place, on the edge of care. We can do more to improve their outcomes. They have got the right, for example, to go to any school. They'll always be top of the admissions criteria to get into any school. So they should be going to the best schools in town. But the state is not a good pushy parent, so poor kids in the care system end up going to the worst schools in town, even though they've got the right to go to the absolutely best ones. And we've tried to give them priority. Mental health, things like that. All these problems of intergenerational poverty, particularly people who are the children of people who've been to prison. They are 250% more likely to end up in, 2.5 times more likely to end up in prison themselves. And so we've got these problems of people who the state has quite a lot of contacts with, a lot of agencies working with them, and yet we don't do enough to make sure they get out of poverty. And lastly but not leastly, education, and the early years in particular. So I think a no-brainer for this coalition government, for the Tories and the Lib Dems, is to pilot some success with Sure Start. Sure Start, really important programme, the right sort of thing to do. We know that early interventions are the way to go, broadly. But as it happens, Sure Start is trying to do a lot of different things on not very much money. And if you look at the programmes that we think work better in the US, the Perry Preschool, Abecedarians, things like that, They were both more expensive and also much more educationally focused. So Sun of Sure Start, I think, should be a much more educational project rather than doing quite a lot of different things. Why do we need to change Sure Start? Unfortunately, we had all these high expectations of it. It was going to be the magic bullet that would, help poor kids catch up before they even start school. But we know that it's actually, from its own evaluation, it's not improving school readiness. It's not helping them catch up. And so if we are going to do that thing, probably the most vital thing for social mobility, the most vital thing in combating future poverty is education, in the early years in particular. But if we're going to do that, we need to be brave and look again at this scheme, because at the moment, it's not going to help poor kids catch up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil, for the now well compressed version of that speech, which is getting better every time.
It's shorter.
But the only trouble with it is that it never learns from anything that I've said. It's always the same. It absorbs nothing.
But do you learn, Polly? Has yours changed?
Well,
in 20 years?
Indeed it has, in terms of priorities. I would like us to focus on the majority of people who are poor. All conversations about poverty tend to, and Ian Duncan Smith's particularly bad at this, plunge straight down to the gutter and look at the very worst families. Let's go and find those drug addicts, those children of prisoners. Let's go and find the worst possible problems we can and worry away about them. Of course we should. But that's not the reason why we have so many poor people in this country. It's not because we have hugely more dysfunctional families than other countries do. It's because we have hugely lower pay for very large numbers of people. The bottom half of society is very lowly paid, have not seen any increase, and they've now stagnated, seen no increase in their income since 2003. This is Resolution Foundation stuff. Let's just think about the 62% of the poor who are in work. And the reason that they're poor is that they're not paid enough. You cannot live on what you're paid on or near the minimum wage. Boris boasted rightly about the living wage, which Ken Livingstone brought in, which he's pushed forward, which is great. But that's only, very few people. You talk about banks. Well, it's only a handful of cleaners in each of those banks. It really hasn't made all that much impact, though it's a very good movement. The problem in this country is that people can work very hard, and sometimes they can work at 2 and 3 jobs. They can be those strivers, they can be those early morning shift workers, not the ones with the blinds down, who work and cannot support their families. Therefore you have tax credits. Therefore we, the taxpayer, have to subsidise those families to keep them at any kind of bearable level, but they're still poor despite tax credits. Is that a sensible way of running an economy? As the economy gets worse, more and more people are being paid more and more tax credits because their working hours shrink. Lots of people, particularly in supermarkets, are finding their working hours shrink, desperate to get more hours, can't get them. Tax credits rise. We, the taxpayer, pay more and more. Partly why the national debt is rising, because of chasing its own tail. So the problem really is the structure. It's much more important. It's much more fun to think about dysfunctional families. But the real serious problem, if you really want to change the structure of poverty in this country, is about money, and it's basically about pay. And if you pay people a lot more, many more people might get into work if there were those jobs. But we never hear very much about unemployment in all of this. I mean, this week in Birmingham, Jaguar wonderfully advertised for just over 1,000 more jobs. Over 20,000 people applied. Well, what about the 19,000 who didn't get those jobs? Are they all slackers and useless and hopeless and families that we should be worried and concerned about? No, the worry is that they haven't got the jobs, or else they've got very low-paying jobs and they can't support themselves and their families, so we, the taxpayers, have to do that. And if we really thought hard about that, about poverty and pay, we would solve so many of the problems that we're all talking about. And then, at the same time, of course, we should be looking at the problems that every society has, and the Victorians and everybody else used to worry about, the truly dysfunctional and so on. Incidentally, there's been research about intergenerational worklessness. There are virtually no families, almost zero, who have been out of work for 3 generations, sometimes 2, but even those, very few, because people go in and out of work, the bumping along the bottom, the insecure job, the temporary job, the agency work, and falling out and in and out and in and out. So the idea that there is this great lazy phalanx of hopeless cases for generations. So, you know, the kind of, and then television doesn't help because that's what they go and look for, because that's what's sexy for a really good documentary. That's what Shameless tells people. There are all these shirkers and skivers. One anecdote, you know, Osborne might use his anecdote, not a real one, stays in people's minds for maybe 20 years compared with any number of statistics. And yet actually it's the figures, and you may dismiss statistics as being sort of boring and irrelevant. It's the figures that really matter in this. The figures about the number
I
of
don't
people who
dismiss at all,
come.
it's just we talk about them. How many times have you talked about figures on poverty and how little has actually changed in the last 20 years?
Well, quite a lot did change, and actually, as Neil was rather more generous than you, the point is that Labour mostly it got over 1 million children out of poverty, and it wasn't poverty plus a pound. Most of that was due to getting single parents into work, which they did very well with. There was a huge increase in the numbers of single parents into work, and that was the biggest single reason for it. But also, of course, it was the direct transfers through tax credits and working tax credits, and you know, quite a lot of them in work. Also, the research shows that it wasn't just getting a few people over the line. It really affected people who were at the very poorest levels, the 40% people almost up to the line but not over. So huge numbers of families were enormously helped by that. So don't just say throwing money at it. True, there is no more money to throw at it. Nobody is going to seriously suggest a huge extra transfer of money to them from now. But for goodness sake, don't let's cut what's there already. The 18 billion that's been cut, the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, says is historically and internationally without precedent as a cut in benefits. Now there's going to be another 10 billion. The scale of it is enormous. Its effect will be gigantic. Before it has even come in, the IFS expects 300,000, a rise of 300,000 more in poverty just in the 3 years, 12-13 to 15-16. There will be very many more than that due to these particular cuts. Is that the legacy the Conservative Party wishes to leave? I think probably not. So I would hang on to follow the money. I totally agree with everything you said about Sure Start, and I think Labour is rethinking in terms of what resources there are put into Sure Start. Sure Starts are wonderful hubs of communities. They are supporters of whole families. They catch problems very early. You're right that they have to be intensive and educational. Elizabeth Truss's suggestion that you can do it all on the cheap and don't bother with having teachers or trained people, let's have a really cheap privatised system, isn't going to work. It's fine perhaps for children who are okay at home, but children who haven't got much language or reading at home really need the highest quality if you're going to make a difference to their opportunities. Last thought I have about social mobility. If you're going to send a child, say, who's done well, comes from Middlesbrough, no jobs, goes to college, goes to university, but you have to send him home until he's 25, what chance of looking for a job somewhere else, getting on his bike? He's got no backing from home, can't get anything. If he can't draw any housing benefit, he's being sent back to where there are no jobs. Those people leaving education, and often leaving some of the poorest areas, you know, you look at somewhere like Middlesbrough, where lots of the young people go, they will all be sent home to live with their parents, if their parents have still got room for them. Is that a sensible way of promoting social mobility? I hope the Conservatives and Lib Dems don't use the phrase social mobility anymore if they're going to make those young people immobile. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Polly. And our final speaker is Chris Goulden from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who do an awful lot of very important work in this area.
Thanks.
Chris.
Well, I agree with Claire for devices. Is that a good hashtag?
It's not there.
I think there is a lot of what talked about poverty and poverty measurement, and I fear that debate is really getting us nowhere. Because everyone really agrees that money is a central feature of poverty, but that there is also more to it than that. I'm interested in what we can agree on and not what divides us in the debate.
This is a fringe meeting.
Yes, but I'm from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So, I mean, the debate gets boiled down to an argument that we've already had over tax credits or universal credit, rather than what we needed for a full strategy against poverty, grounded in the evidence about what works. So we need to focus on the most cost-effective ways of raising the living standards of people in poverty, which is a slightly different focus than looking at income poverty. At the moment, I think government is confused as well. So we've got social justice strategy in DWP, we've got social mobility strategy from the Cabinet Office in education, and we've got the Treasury concerned about welfare cuts and cutting public spending. And you've also got child poverty hanging over it as well, like Gordon Brown's ghost. And the problem with all the strategies we've had on poverty is that they don't say how the targets are going to be met. What they do is list existing policies, like work programme or the pupil premium, but there's no explicit link to the outcomes that the strategies seek. So how many children is the work programme going to take out of poverty? Some for sure, but we've no real idea. So there's a problem with all the myths that circulate about poverty and prevent these strategies working. I'll just mention a couple. The first one is work is the best route out of poverty, which on one level is almost a truism. But it's important to remember when you look at the dynamics of this, when someone from a family in poverty gets a new job, only 56% are taken out of poverty. So it's only just over half. So that means there's something seriously wrong with the kinds of jobs that people in poverty are getting. And it's even worse for families who are in persistent poverty, so they've been in income poverty for a longer period of time. Then it's only 28% are taken out of poverty when someone gets a new job. So it affects those families even harder. The second common issue is this 3 generations who have never worked, which kind of has become a fact in itself. But when you look at the figures, there's only 15,000 households where there's 2 generations who have never worked. So 3 generations must logically be a much smaller subset of that. And I think that's not really getting to grips with the real problem when you think that there are 6 million people who are underemployed. That includes everyone who's unemployed, people on other benefits looking for work, and people who are doing part-time jobs who want more work. So that's the real scale of the problem, not these 3 generations who have never worked. However, I'm not saying that these objections are unimportant. We do need more jobs, and good quality employment is probably the best route out of poverty. And there are some families and areas suffering from an entrenched lack of jobs. Income is not the only measure of poverty, and taking 60% is arbitrary. Surely, though, we can live with a little more nuance there. So it's time to move the debate on, I think, and accept that poverty is a complex and long-term problem. There's nothing magic about the year 2020. It's much more important to assess what impact we're likely to have with the range of policies at our disposal, particularly in the economy that we've got. So I'll just finish by talking about 4 ways from our research that I think this could be done better in terms of an anti-poverty strategy. The tax and benefits system needs to balance what's provided for a minimum income with reasonable withdrawal of support as earnings rise. And universal credit, again I agree with Claire on this, that it provides a really good framework for doing so, but the risk is that it won't be enough to provide people with a basic income, and the withdrawal rates are still quite punitive. Secondly, markets that lead to reductions in the cost and improvements in the quality of essential goods and services. So this is about what things cost, not just what people's income what their income is. So it's not just that people in poverty are likely to pay more for the basics, like credit and fuel. It's also the cost of all the mainstream services, such as childcare and housing, and things that Neil referred to. Thirdly, investment in longer-term poverty prevention through well-targeted education and skills interventions. People always say well-targeted, but it doesn't really mean anything unless you say what you targeted on. And what I mean is targeting on households in poverty, not just the low-skilled or low-paid as a group. The vast majority of low-paid workers aren't actually in relative income poverty. Poverty is a household issue. So if you just try and target through wages and skills policies, there's a huge amount of dead weight if you want to address poverty. And I don't think that's really been appreciated. And finally, most importantly, we do need millions of better jobs in the economy. We've modelled the impact of having 1.5 million new jobs by 2020, which was okay at the time, but now looks quite ambitious. But even this doesn't avert the projected growth in poverty. So the risk is that we keep going with strategies that don't work and ad hoc adjustments to the welfare system. And on the basis of current tax and benefit plans, including universal credit, alongside expected changes in jobs, earnings and demographics, we're looking at an absolute income poverty rate of 23% for children by 2020. I'm pretty sure that's something that none of us wants to see happen. But the risk is if we don't start having better strategies against poverty, this is going to happen. And these must be based on evidence about what works and an appreciation of the costs of taking action, as well as the huge cost of poverty to our society. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all our panel members for keeping it short and allowing plenty of time for questions. Who wants to ask a question? If you could, I'm not interested in who you are or what you represent. I'm just interested if you would say before you ask a question whether you agree with Polly Toynbee or Claire. Gentleman over there in the back.
Yes, I'm entirely in agreement with Claire. And occasionally,
Both I said it all.
occasionally a little in agreement with occasionally a little.
But I think we're in the
Yes, indeed, with the majority view then. Now, I went to another French meeting this morning where the Evening Standards Literacy campaign had resulted in 100% of the children in its targeted schools, St Mary's and Lambeth, actually reaching level 2 in their reading, and 100% or 91% in reading and maths at level 4 in Key Stage 4. It seems to me the last government tried to tackle these things and then sort of discovered how hard it was and then started dumbing down the system instead. And I think it's a real triumph for Nick Gibb that his approach to reading has actually, with the Sanders campaign, because they were doing phonics in the first place, actually seems to have made the breakthrough impact in this school and got past some of the basic skills. And I'm just thinking that, just how far people would agree, that you cannot get through this without equipping the children with the skills they need. There is no other solution to it.
Polly.
Brilliant scheme, Every Child a Reader, developed by KPMG. They modelled it, they piloted it, and finally they persuaded the Labour government that it really would work and they would roll it out. And it was rolled out everywhere. It has been taken the ring fence off it. It exists in some places, but schools have to pay for it from themselves out of their budget. It has brilliant outcome measures, totally measured. Children who got 30 weeks of one-to-one intensive, then large.
It's not the same one.
It's not the same one, but this is the one that was there that was rolled out everywhere.
Yeah,
but
it's
when
not the same
Michael
thing at all.
came, he said,
It's completely different.
I want to rip up everything that was there before, and so it went. And actually, it worked really well. It was already, it was already embedded.
No, it's not.
You don't know it.
No, I do know. It's the reading recovery thing.
It's called Every Child a Reader.
Every Child a Reader.
Yeah.
Right.
And
But it's not the same. It's not the same.
Well,
as the scheme
there are a
that
number of
Nick's using.
different schemes. The point was, here was a scheme that worked, that was developed by KPMG, it was their idea, and it was pulled out, which is a great shame. It's no longer ring-fenced and there in every school for a certain number of children in every school who are the fallers behind at the age of 6.
Yeah.
That was targeted on them. And I'm sorry it's gone. I'm glad that the Evening Standard's doing what it can. I'm glad that some schools have kept it going out of their own funds. But
You're
different. Totally right. It doesn't matter which scheme.
Yeah, well, it
as long as
does,
it's
because it's our scheme and not your scheme.
No, all that matters is that it has a good outcome measurement that's been properly researched and tested.
Yeah, well,
No doubt more than one.
well, let's not get one thing.
Very quickly.
Well, I
Claire,
just
do you
think
want
it's a very interesting insight. I mean, you're there. Look, having struggled to teach 3 children to read. I mean, it's great, but what Polly describes is the the big state. Reading is good. Every child must be a reader. We will have a national programme that schools have to go through lots of bureaucratic hurdles to access. I know people who were practitioners of this. There is now a pupil premium that means if schools feel, and I do understand the issue around pupil premium, it must not be used to plug gaps in funding. It must be, this is the idea, this is why it has to be monitored very carefully. If schools feel it's an appropriate programme to use, they could bring it in. I have to say the other thing, we had a fantastic debate about childcare in the earlier session. Well done, we talked a lot about, we have teach first, what about teach last? What about getting older people into the system who potentially would even go and volunteer in these reading schemes? Why does everything, if schools all understand that having children read early is a good thing, they are empowered now to do whatever it takes with their budgets to make it happen. It might also be that it's better to get the school to go and pick them up in the morning because that kid can't actually get to school. I trust the teachers to do that. I don't, I'm afraid, trust the Department of Education because it will get wrapped up in all the targets and nonsense and all league table measurements of whether you've got readers. It's nonsense. Let the schools do it. They know what to do and clearly it can work.
Yeah.
On Every Child a Reader, we did look at this, and it did initially produce an improvement, but then it just levelled off. So I'm not as convinced as Polly is that it was sort of the magic bullet. And it's true of a lot of other things. At the start of things like literature, all the centralised schemes, they were quite good, and they did something at first, but then that didn't take you further. You need to do something else instead. So I'm not as much of a fan of it as you are, perhaps.
Well, the kind of attainment gap and educational standards have been improving since John Major, so you can thank him for turning things around. But we need to look at not just the supply of skilled workers eventually in the economy, it's also the demand from employers for their skills. So it's more a question of raising the ambition of employers than it is the ambition of the workers at the moment.
Very good. Can we have a question from a Polly Toynbee supporter?
Oh,
yes, go on, in the middle.
Okay, so on the whole, I buy Polly's analysis of poverty in the round. I guess though Family Action so represents a very disadvantaged group. And particularly I'm interested in Neil O'Brien's analysis and what you were saying about early intervention, Neil. What do you think then is your analysis of taking money out of the early intervention grants to pay for the 2-year-old offer? Are you with the 2-year-old offer, or do you think we should be keeping that money for early intervention in the rounds?
So
Very good specific question.
So there's all these things that have been put into a sort of combined ring fence, so local authorities get to choose between these different things, particularly Sure Start. So it seems to be what's happening is that a lot of local authorities are choosing not to do Sure Start, particularly in more middle class areas. So the choice in a sense has been handed over to them. In terms of the overall balance of spending between early years and other things we can do to reduce poverty, I would like to divert resources more towards early years things rather than on income transfers. That's the main kind of content of my speech. So that would be my answer.
Can I just say from the chair that I don't actually agree with forcing children to try to read too early. I think it leads to all sorts of problems, especially with boys. Now, a Claire Perry supporter. Yes, at the back there.
You talked about definition of poverty. What does poverty mean to the panel, and what would the better definition of poverty be?
Oh. Someone actually wants the panel to answer the question that was set in the first place. Oh dear. Right, sorry, let's start with Polly again.
What does it mean? Well, in the Child Poverty Act, there are actually 4 different measures. People keep saying, oh, there's only this one measure. Actually, there are 4 different ones. And the interesting thing is that people have taken all sorts of different measures, and they all come up with pretty much the same number of people who are poor, whichever way you slice it. One interesting way, because it also becomes relative, is to just ask a very large opinion poll of people, what do you think a family needs for the absolute basics in order not to be poor, and then measure how many people fall below that. And most people these days say, well, let's say a television, they say a spare pair of shoes, a winter coat, and they say a holiday once a year. I mean, there are a number of things, like be able to have a birthday party, able to afford to buy a present to take to other children's birthday parties. These things are regarded by the majority of the population as pretty essential for an ordinary civilized family life, below which you shouldn't fall. It's nothing luxurious, it's nothing fantastic, but we know that, you know, very large numbers of families fall below that. I think that's quite a good approach because it makes it more real to people. They stop and think, would it be terrible if my children, because some children never go to anyone else's birthday party, never have anybody to tea because they don't have tea. And that's quite shocking, and people think, God, you're not even being able to go to a birthday party because you couldn't afford the present. Those things make it real, so I quite like that measure, but it does come out pretty much the same numerically as any other. So I'm not too fussed about whether it's the 60%. 60% is only useful because it's the international measure, but it's not a distorting measure, it's much the same as anyone else's.
I have to say I agree, and I think there's an awful lot of preconceptions, isn't there, about poverty. Well, is it being able to afford a Sky dish? I mean, Polly's just gone through a very sensible list, I think, of what are things that we would all feel would be an appropriate, level of aspiration for a family. And I suppose, I mean, the other thing that does get through, I mean, there's a whole sort of dimension about sort of home life poverty, I suppose, which I think about a little bit around, children not seeing their parents because their parents are working very long hours, the sort of lack of, the dining table. I mean, I was very shocked to hear that something like, 2/3 of families no longer eat meals together around a table. As somebody who is, obsessive about making them all sit down and use a knife and fork. There are things that sort of home life poverty, I think, but you can't measure that, and that's a choice, so we mustn't get dictatorial about it. Do you mind if I just loop back to the lady from the previous question, because it relates really, I'm really interested in the Shores, because I'm a great fan. Sure Start, when it works well, is brilliant. And as somebody who helped write the health visitor policy in opposition, I'm very keen that we put health visitors in Sure Start, so we're very good at potentially getting families in. But I have 3 really great 4 Sure Start centres in my constituency, and I was just looking at the child poverty numbers. You know, one of them is an award where child poverty, as currently defines, ranges from 3 to 10%. One of them's in an area where it ranges from 4 to 10%, and one's an area where the average is around 15%. So I actually want the local authority, and all of those centres are up and running, they're run by 4 children, they're great, but I want far more micro spending of the money and targeting for specific families. I just think the notion that you can sit there and say 3,500 centres, every child must be able to access them. For what benefit? You know, this is meant to be a way of getting children from poor backgrounds into a better place, not for, frankly, as I have done, middle class mummies to go and do song time. I'm sorry, but I think we just need to target the money better locally, and I think if we have responsible authorities and take off the ring fence, that's what's happening.
Can I, a point of information, can I ask Claire a question? Yes. I just want to ask you about your health visitor. I didn't know that you'd written a health.
I'm sure you
so
did.
What's become of it? Why no health visitors?
Well, because it's there are health visitor recruitment numbers are going up, and of course this is the most valued professional visit that pregnant women and postnatal women get, and it is a way of signposting all sorts of issues that are not class issues, not economic issues. And the last government utterly debased this profession, and there was an exodus of health visitors, because I don't know why, was it considered too middle class? It was a nonsense. And I am so proud of the fact that we have worked with human nature and put funding back in for that and linked it into Sure Start, because I think it does a very much better job.
Large areas, they're now getting assistance.
Could you campaign for the early intervention grant, because it has been slashed for the 2-year-olds offer? So I'm really pleased that you believe in effective spending, but the money has to be there to do it, and it's being cut to the tune of billions.
It's not though. It's not. It's not. And there's this idea that hundreds of Sure Start centres are closing. They aren't.
Well,
we are seeing a refocusing.
240 have closed,
well,
and they've lost 20% out of the early years fund.
Again, this is, and they are refocusing on the families that need the most. Look, we don't have any money. It gets back to this benefit question. I'm sorry to shout. We've created a system where we have a benefit system where there's an incentive for people to not think about the next child, or the next thing that might push them even further into poverty, or further away from the workplace.
Benefits don't begin to cover the cost of a child.
Or
it's just not an incentive to have a child.
Look, I'm sorry, Polly. If you have an ability to come out of school, and I'm not targeting, get into a relationship, get help with your housing support, get help with, of course it's an incentive. There is no incentive to stop and think about what my other constituents have to think about, which is I actually can't afford to have a child because I can't afford to move to a bigger house. But it's true. It's not.
Teen pregnancy.
It's not
plummeted
teen pregnancy.
because of the teen pregnancy strategy.
It's not teen
As a
pregnancy.
result, there are many fewer.
I wasn't talking about teen pregnancy. I'm
talking about coming out of school and having a baby in order to get
a complete lack of incentives in the welfare system to make people think how people who are in the non-welfare system think, and that is just wrong. It's like borrowing more to get out of debt. It doesn't make any sense fundamentally.
Very good. Right, let's get some more questions from the floor. Sorry, this lady here and then this gentleman here.
Can I just ask a question about attitudes to welfare? Because we've had the NatSen evidence about hardening of attitudes, public attitudes over time. And I want to ask the panel, what do you think about basically the shift away from universal benefits like child benefit, benefits for older people like bus passes, etc., away into more targeted benefits? So I can understand what the rationale for it is, but aren't we just going to further marginalise the welfare system so that it's very much about an other rather than about us? And what does that mean then in terms of attitudes to welfare? Are we on a trajectory to becoming a harsher, crueler society?
Yes,
I want
let's take some more questions.
I want to agree with something Chris said and disagree with something Neil said, because there are 4 ways of measuring child poverty in the Child Poverty Act, which often is misportrayed in the media and by critics. And you mentioned about transience, Neil. Well, one of those 4 targets is the persistent poverty target, and it's right that there is a basket of targets. And we must remember as well that the targets are the finishing line. When you get all this other debate about the real areas where action is needed, well, the engine of the bill to get us there is a whole list of statutory requirements of what needs to be considered. That you have to consider education, you have to consider childcare, you have to consider health, which could include addiction, you have to consider parenting skills, you have to consider parental employment, all these things. The problem that we had with the government strategy is it put all its effort into arguing a narrative, and it didn't put any fuel in the tank. It didn't properly get on top of doing things. And we've seen a lot of local authorities with their local child poverty strategies getting on with it really well. So isn't it time the government just took what it already has there and got on with it?
Can you just name a local authority that's done it well?
If you look up in the northeast, where they've got the Northeast Child Poverty Commission, where they're all linking up, they're really drilling down on what the actions are that they can take.
Okay, sorry, one more question in the middle here.
Yes, I'd like to build on what that lady said in terms of harshness within society. Does that actually include slashing social housing grants, the rising number of homelessness cases that we see, and those on the social waiting list? And can become home, is that going to become the norm of this new benchmark?
Sorry, let's start with Polly again, sorry. To go back to you, Polly.
About attitudes, yeah, I think we've seen here at this conference, speaker after speaker talking about people on benefits as being lazy and idle, being wrongly incentivised to have babies early and not do any work, stay at home behind the blinds. It's just become the absolute default language that's used here. And then at the same time, George Osborne can say, but we mustn't demonise people. The demonisation has been extraordinary, and I think historically we'll look back and say, how extraordinary that at a time when we have more people long-term out of work than any time since Thatcher's era, when unemployment is the real problem, and it's a pressing problem, and it's desperate families. Well, not long-term unemployment, isn't it? No, it's not. It's going up. Desperate families. Wait a minute.
Do you mean unemployment or do you mean long-term unemployment?
I said long-term unemployment is going. That's the most serious because most people get jobs. Most people do get jobs within 6 months, 9 months of losing their job. But the long-term tail is going up and up, and that's the most worrying because that's where the most damage is done to people and to families. At a time when that's happening, why is the whole political language not about the problem of unemployment and the problem about poverty in work because work pays too little? Why is it all turned around and suddenly become pitting those low paid in work against those who haven't got any work, divide and rule, real enmity, so that even now the disabled, the numbers of people who get abused and harassed, who are disabled because they've become part of the scrounger language too, is really quite shocking. And when disability benefits are cut next April, I think there may be quite a kickback. I think suddenly, even papers like the Daily Mail will start reporting on those families who have, sometimes 2 disabled children losing all their disability living allowance. You're going to have the Paralympians out campaigning about this at the same time as, council tax benefit is cut. And I think that although this conference is very confident that it's got public opinion well on its side at the moment, I don't think that's going to last when the reality really sinks in.
Claire, do you want to come back on that?
Well, I guess I think we're talking about a reality actually when it comes to the sort of the benefits question, Polly. And in fact, the language in my constituency is in many of you talk to is often much harsher, and there are all sorts of campaign or people talking about, well, we should just stop paying unemployment after 6 months or 40. I just don't recognise this idea that we are somehow coming up with harsh language. I think we're talking about a problem, which is that the welfare state model that provided universal benefits for all, with a little bit of means testing around the edges, is just simply unaffordable. If you want to not sleep at night, I recommend that you read the OBR's report, the Fiscal Sustainability Report. And I'm no economist, very dull, but it talks about this gap. We are getting older, healthcare is getting more expensive, social care is a massive problem. We haven't talked about elder poverty, and these are the things because well quite, but these are the things that actually, if you are a fiscally responsible government, you try to deal with, and you try, and just in a way, this is why I'm not a very good politician, because I rather hate the fact that we always get massively politicised about this. I mean, as Chris said, the route out of the real route out of poverty is quality jobs, not jobs. You're absolutely right, Polly. Low-paid jobs is not necessarily.
So somebody's got to do the low-paid job. Somebody's got to clean the hospital floors.
But ideally, you want to, work whatever. But what you want is well-paid quality jobs. So how are we going to get those jobs? How are we going? Are we going to have a sugar rush? Bunch of borrowing, bunch of public investment, which we have tried before, which has failed, and by the way, we can see in the States it's failed. Or are we going to relentlessly try and get the private sector across the country to grow? Are we going to try and deal with the crumbling infrastructure? You know, we've got, what, 70 miles of high-speed rail. Morocco has 433. The average age of our sewers is 100 years old in London. We have spent nothing on the fabric of this country, or very little, relative. No, we were the least, the country that invested least in our infrastructure in the OECD in the last 10 years. That is how I think you create a sustainable economy, and you create taxes, and that gives you a welfare state that is sustainable. I mean, it is a question of sustainability, and I want my children to grow up in a country that has an NHS and free education and a welfare state that works. And I don't think we're on that trajectory unless we solve these problems. So I don't like the rhetoric. I think we're dealing with necessary truths, and I wish we could stop having black and white politicisation of this stuff.
Very good. Neil, do you want to come back on the definition of poverty point there?
On definition, so if you ask the public, I mean, they have quite a sort of restrictive definition. About 70% of people say it's not having enough food to eat and not a place to live. So they're quite sort of traditional in what they think the word poverty means. It is a very, very strong word. I think one of the reasons why we kind of disagree on this panel about poverty is people do use the word at cross purposes. I mean, there is a kind of sense of it as kind of income inequality, and it's about, you know, sort of the distribution of income. And then there's this kind of concept of deeper poverty, and people on the right tend to be more kind of drawn to that, I think. So
I was talking specifically about the Child Poverty Act and the mischaracterisation.
Oh, sorry, your four targets thing. Sorry, I was sort of answering a question of the gentleman behind you. So yeah, there are 4 different targets. They're all about income. None of them are about services. So there's that
material deprivation
and low income. Yeah.
Not
so if you take out, one of the things we're going to do in the report that we've got coming out is take apart material deprivation from low income, which is quite interesting. So it stops it looking just like such a low income indicator, and try to widen out. But they do all have this same problem. They only reward the cash transfers. So if you move someone into social housing and their bills fall, oh, poverty has actually got worse. You know, if you give someone a better education, that doesn't do anything to poverty. And they're all income measures in the kind of thing. And Polly says, well, there are 4 targets, but then she says, we lifted 1 million children out of poverty. And that is how we've always played the debate. It's always, there's a single measure. And the problem with it is, this relates to something Chris said, it was a target that basically ended up with just the Treasury being responsible for meeting it. We'd fiddle with tax credits, and we would be able to say, we've lifted in this budget 50,000 children out of poverty. And one of my colleagues used to do this for a living. So it is really how we measure it.
Will you not be worried? Will you not be worried at the end of 5 years if you've got hugely more children in that poverty? You'll just say, well, that's just a technicality, it's not relevant. Wouldn't you rather be able to say, actually, you know what, we got more children out of poverty?
Put like that, I would rather we had more children out of poverty. I think we can probably both agree on that. It's not about, you know, what we're going to do. So we're in quite a difficult situation. We've just had this enormous recession, and there's no money. Now, we have a kind of empirical disagreement about whether there's a big pot of money we could get out of the rich. You've written that you think the rate that you can set the top rate of tax at to get the most revenue in is between 60 and 70%. I don't think that's right. I think it's much lower. And I think, although you're very happy with a Miliband at the moment, over the moon, I think you're going to be disappointed if he becomes Prime Minister, because we will discover that there isn't a lot of free money in the system, that you are going to have to make some difficult choices. But we've got to be very careful in making those difficult choices. So the key thing of there is to speak softly and to have an effective system. Let's not go on about scrounging all these things. But on the other hand, let's have a system that's highly personalised in job centres. So we know from DWP's research and polling that there are about 30% of people who have some kind of attitudinal problem within job seekers allowance. Either they don't really have the skills for the kind of jobs that they aspire to, or they, in some way, their attitudes are not right in terms of them getting into work. So there is an issue there. Let's not demonise them, but there is an issue that we need to address with better job centres, a more targeted system, and particularly more support for people who are bumping in and out of work. They are trying hard.
What proportion of the unemployed do you think are in this, you know, there to blame category?
It's not a there to blame thing, but the
DWP... All right, so they've got problems. As opposed to the 19,000 who applied for the Jaguar job and didn't get it.
Well, the DWP, their research, I mentioned the 30% figure. Now, you said that my speech never changes any of these events, but I said in my speech, what we should do is reduce middle class benefits to do direct government job creation, and then you said, no one ever talks about unemployment. So I am sort of responding to some of the things you're saying in these things. I don't think that unemployment is not a problem.
I missed you
I'm not in favour of child poverty.
Sorry, I'm on my unemployment. It's a good thing to say.
There is a sort of reality, and I mean, we've got to be clear also about, it's not just about more stick. There are people who absolutely cannot work. You've got to be very careful about the disability benefits. I agree with all that. But at the same time, there is going to have to be some sort of proper... Labour, I know for a fact that if Labour had been re-elected, there'd have been something like the assessment that's now been put in for DLA, because they knew it was a tap with no washer on it, and it was just loads of money running out of it. So there would have been a test. The question is how to get a test right, not whether we should have one or not.
Very serious danger the panel's going to end up in gooey agreement at the end. Chris, do you want to agree with everybody else?
No, but I think there's at least 4 things everyone has agreed on so far. So that's a start. I think that attitudes are definitely turning against welfare and benefit claimants as a group, although it's a very diverse and dynamic group, of course. But the irony is that there's a kind of reaction against a perception that Labour increased benefits across the board, when in fact it was mainly child tax credit and other benefits that were leading where the money was going. So the people that didn't benefit were childless working age adults, and their levels of absolute poverty, where the poverty line is fixed and then just raised by inflation, have not changed for something like 30 or 40 years, IFS have found. But they're the people that are receiving, on the receiving end of the backlash against the perceptions about increases in benefits. It's not really the families that, some families, but it's kind of a cruel irony, really, that this group, the ones that never benefited at all, and are still not, but they're the ones getting all the blame.
I'm sorry I haven't got time for any more questions. Did you want to come in with?
There's a gentleman in the red raised a really interesting point about housing and social housing, and if you forgive me, pick up on that, because again, big rural constituency, 12,000 people on the waiting list, a third of my surgeries appointments are usually housing related. We just have a massive problem with social housing. I hate affordable housing is a bit of a red herring, I think, because how long does it stay affordable? But social housing is absolutely something we have hugely underbuilt. And the big challenge now is with no money, how you can get innovation. And Manchester, by that, have just put in money from their pension fund into a social housing construction project, which I think is really interesting. So it's not just bringing in private sector funding, it's not going down the dreaded PFI, it's just trying to tap into other pools. And look, it's in that, we are in a time of economic scraping the barrel for every penny, while we still have very persistent problems of poverty. So can't we just all agree to go away and think of an innovative idea that doesn't require a huge amount of government spending to do something? So tapping into pension funds, which are searching for high rates of investment right now, and getting them to invest in social housing, which is a huge need, I suspect, across the country, would be a good way of tackling one of these causes of poverty, in my view. So let's get our brains working on the solution. And well, exactly, and but all these things. But send me the emails. Send me all the emails to this report. But there is the debate.
City, 2 moments away. And I'm a woman who brought 3 children of my own. And I have to tell you, I've worked for politicians. I'm not a naive person. I did a degree as a single parent, and I'm proud of it. I brought 3 boys up. It's not easy saying no to children. This is not an option. What you're putting forward. You're going to cause immense social division. You haven't got a clue.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, madam, because I think that what is the problem is, what do we keep on borrowing and spending? Thinking won't fix it. Well, I think action is absolutely right, but we've talked too much about these high-level things, and actually there's a huge amount of agreement on some of the issues we need to focus on. Let's just get on and do that, and stop pretending that there's a golden goose somewhere that's going to lay a fiscal egg, because it's not. That's the problem.
Very good. I knew we'd solve the problem. Thank you very much to all our panellists, and thank you very much to.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.